Gun crime has always been a hidden business. The smart ones never showed their faces. They never filmed their weapons. They never posted their threats with names attached. They moved in the dark, kept their hands empty in public, and let the violence speak for itself when it had to. The men in this case never got that memo. They picked up their phones and filmed themselves handling firearms. They made drill videos referencing real shootings on real estates. They put together a video that assigned bullets to named individuals from a rival London gang. They went to a town in Essex to rob 3 men of £4,000, and one of them dropped a loaded handgun magazine on the ground while doing it. The whole lifestyle was being uploaded onto a phone the police would eventually be holding in their hands. Today we are covering the South London Woolio gang, whose footage ended every single one of their operations. What you are about to hear will show you exactly how a gang gets caught by its own camera. Section 1. Woolwich, Charlton, and a feud that lived on a phone screen. If you stood in the middle of Woolwich at any point across late 2023, you would have seen a part of South London that looks ordinary on the surface. Buses running along the high street, shops opening in the morning, families walking their children through the General Gordon Square. A few miles down the road, in Charlton, the Cherry Orchard estate sits off Charlton Road in a quiet residential pocket of the borough. Neither location announces itself as a place where firearms get fired. Both of them, across October and November 2023, became points on the map of an ongoing gang feud that the Metropolitan Police's Trident Gang Crime Command had been tracking for months. The feud had a name on one side, the Woolio Gang. The name itself was a compression of Woolwich, the Greenwich Borough neighbourhood that gave the gang its base and its identity. Woolios operated out of Woolwich and the surrounding South East London postcodes SE9, SE11, SE18, SE27. The members lived in flats and houses across Eltham, Lambeth, Abbey Wood, West Norwood, and Charlton itself. The gang on the other side of the feud was another London gang. Police never publicly named the rival group in their official statements about the case. What they did say was that the feud between the two groups was being played out through 3 things at the same time: social media posts, drill music videos, and actual violence. Step back from the individuals for a moment and you can see the shape of how a modern London gang feud works. There is the digital layer, where the threats are issued, the disrespect is broadcast, and the rival gang's members are named directly in lyrics or in clips. There is the social layer, where members of each gang spend time in their own postcodes, around their own people, marking territory. And there is the violent layer, where the digital and the social spill out into the streets, into the estates, and onto the actual bodies of the people the threats were aimed at. The Woolio feud was operating across all 3 layers simultaneously. The 2 shootings on the Cherry Orchard estate were the violent layer. The first happened in October 2023. 2 9mm casings were recovered at the scene. The intended target for that shooting was never identified by the Met. The second happened in November 2023. The victim of that one survived a non-fatal gunshot wound to his arm. Both incidents were under active Trident investigation by the time the wider Woolio case began to take shape. To anyone outside that piece of South London, 2 shootings on one estate in 2 months might sound like a single neighbourhood having a bad winter. To Trident detectives, it was the visible part of a feud whose less visible parts were being uploaded onto Instagram, onto messaging apps, and into drill videos circulating online. The digital layer was where the gang was making the strategic mistake that would eventually anchor the prosecution. Members of Woolio were not staying off camera. They were on camera. They were holding firearms. They were referring, in footage and in messages, to the criminal use those firearms had been put to. They were producing drill videos that went out to a small audience of friends, rivals, and curious viewers. And somewhere in that small audience were people who would eventually be sitting in a Crown Court jury box, looking at the same content with a very different interpretation. To put that in perspective, you have to understand what a courtroom does with a video of a young man holding a firearm. The video does not need a translator. It does not need a forensic interpreter. It is a piece of behavioural evidence that any jury can read in under 3 seconds. When the same person also has messages on their phones celebrating the shooting of a rival, and when those messages can be timed against actual police-confirmed shootings, the video stops being content and starts being conduct. The Woolly O members who picked up phones and pointed cameras at themselves were producing exactly that kind of conduct evidence, voluntarily, repeatedly, across multiple members of the gang. By the time the case eventually closed at Basildon Crown Court on Friday 28 March 2025, 6 men aged between 18 and 28 had been convicted of conspiracy to possess firearms with intent to endanger life or to cause fear of violence. The combined sentencing total handed down across the 6 was 41 years and 6 months. 2 of the sentences would later be increased on appeal in June 2025, after the Solicitor General referred the case to the Court of Appeal under the unduly lenient sentence scheme. The investigation that produced those convictions had been a joint operation between Essex Police's Serious and Organised Crime Unit and the Metropolitan Police's Trident Crime Command, running for 18 months across 3 parallel strands. What none of the Woolly O members had reckoned with was the fact that the entire prosecution case against all 6 of them would eventually rest on the contents of one mobile phone. The phone belonged to the youngest member of the gang. The phone was seized in Aveley, Essex, the morning after a robbery went wrong, and it was sitting in a police evidence bag before any of the gang members on the wider digital layer realised the police had it. The footage on that phone was not just a few clips. It was a high volume of criminal material that included a video featuring one of the senior members of the gang assigning bullets by name to individuals from the rival gang. That single video, more than any other piece of evidence, would become the spine of the prosecution case. Section 2. The drill videos, the social media, and the bullets assigned to named individuals. A drill music video on its own is not a criminal offence. Thousands of drill tracks have been uploaded to YouTube, SoundCloud and Instagram across the last decade by artists from every corner of London, Manchester, Birmingham and Liverpool. Most of them are music. Some of them are stylised. Some of them reference rival areas and rival crews in ways that are part of the genre's grammar. The line between a drill video as art and a drill video as evidence runs through one specific question. Does the content describe real violence committed by real people against other real people who can be identified? When the answer is yes, the video stops being a track and starts being a confession. The Woolly O videos crossed that line. The phone seized from Brian Adu in Aveley contained footage of the group handling firearms and referring to its criminal use. That phrasing comes from the official Solicitor General's summary of the case, written in plain language for the public record. Footage, group, handling, firearms, criminal use. Each word in that sentence is doing a specific job. Footage means video. Group means more than one person on camera. Handling means physically holding. Firearms means actual guns, not props. Referring to its criminal use means the people on camera were not just posing with the weapons, they were talking about what those weapons had been used for. The most damaging single piece of content on the phone was a video featuring Roquib Ladiega. Ladiega was 23 years old and lived on Westhorn Avenue in Eltham, postcode SE9. In the video, bullets were assigned to named individuals from other London gangs. The mechanic of that kind of content has a specific function. The video says, in effect, that this bullet is for this person and that bullet is for that person. The names mentioned are real. The faces and addresses behind those names are knowable to anyone in the rival gang. The video is a public threat list, shared with an audience that includes both the rival group's members and the wider audience of friends and acquaintances who circulate the content further. The strange genius of the whole thing is that the Woolly O members who produced that video probably believed they were performing at the rivals rather than confessing to the police. The audience they were imagining was the rival gang. The audience they got, eventually, was an Essex police detective and a Crown Prosecution Service barrister sitting in front of a Basildon jury. The same words that had been intended to scare a rival gang member into silence became words that established intent in a courtroom. Conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to endanger life is a charge that requires the prosecution to demonstrate the intent. A video that names individuals and assigns bullets to them is, on its own, almost a complete demonstration of intent. Beyond the bullet assignment video, the phone contained a wider archive of criminal material. Messages were found celebrating the shooting of a rival gang member. Other messages discussed how to retrieve the loaded handgun magazine that had been lost during the Aveley robbery. Further messages showed members of the gang attempting to pressure the victim of the Aveley robbery into withdrawing his support for the prosecution. Each of those 3 message threads was its own separate prosecution exhibit. The celebration messages tied the gang to the Cherry Orchard shootings. The magazine retrieval messages tied the gang directly to the Aveley robbery and the firearm involved. The pressure messages tied them to a separate and additional offence of perverting the course of justice. The mindset is the giveaway. Once a gang has reached the point where it is texting on the same phone that holds its drill videos about how to retrieve a piece of forensic evidence the police are about to find, the operational discipline that keeps most criminal groups out of court has already collapsed. The Woolio members were treating their phones the same way most people treat their phones, as personal devices for personal communication. The problem is that personal communication, in a gang context, is the same thing as operational communication. Anything said on the phone is admissible if the phone is recovered and the device password is bypassed. Detective Inspector Yoni Adler from Essex Police's Serious and Organised Crime Unit summarised the pattern after the convictions came through. He described the Woolios as having boasted about their criminal activity, having come to Essex to commit further crime, and having carried firearms while filming themselves doing so. He was not editorialising. He was describing in plain language what the evidence pile in front of the court actually contained. The gang had filmed themselves with guns. The film had been recovered. The film had been played to the jury. The Solicitor General, Lucy Rigby, KCMP, would later describe the Woolios as a ruthless gang who had boasted about their criminal activities online while using dangerous weapons to terrorise and threaten their communities. The phrasing came after the appeal, but the underlying assessment had been part of the prosecution case from the start. Boasting online was not a side detail of the case, it was the case. The boasting was the evidence was the conviction. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The starting point of all of this, the place where the digital evidence transitioned from a background problem into an active prosecution file, was a residential street in Aveley, Essex. The gun on that street was real. The magazine on the ground was real. And one of the people involved was about to walk back into the same area the next morning to a question he could not credibly answer. Section 3. 2 shootings on the Cherry Orchard estate. The Cherry Orchard estate sits in a residential pocket of Charlton, postcode SE77DX, off Charlton Road. The estate is a mix of low-rise blocks and houses, managed historically by Charlton Triangle Housing and now part of the Peabody Group. On a normal evening, the estate is the same as any other South London residential block. Children playing, parents coming home from work, lights coming on in flats as the autumn nights draw in. Across October and November 2023, the estate was the scene of 2 separate firearms incidents that the Metropolitan Police's Trident Gang Crime Command would spend the next year and a half working backwards from. The first incidents happened in October 2023. By the time officers arrived, the people involved had already gone. What they found at the scene were 2 9mm casings on the ground. A 9mm casing is the spent metal cartridge that gets ejected from a semi-automatic handgun every time a round is fired. 2 casings means 2 rounds discharged. The casings tell investigators a specific weapon type, a specific caliber, and a specific physical location where the firearm was operated. What the casings did not tell them, and what nobody at the scene was willing to fill in, was who the rounds had been aimed at. The intended target for that first shooting has never been identified. The person the Woolio members were trying to reach that night either did not come forward or could not be located. That detail matters. It tells you something about the layer of South London the feud was operating inside. The intended target was almost certainly someone the gang knew about, someone the rival gang knew about, and someone the wider gang ecosystem in Greenwich Borough knew about. The fact that they never surfaced as a named victim means either they were not present when the shots were fired, or they were present and chose not to engage with police about it. In gang feuds that play out across postcodes, victims of attempted shootings often do not present themselves. They go to ground. They handle the response within their own circle. The second incident happened in November 2023, also on the Cherry Orchard estate. This one had a victim. A man sustained a non-fatal gunshot wound to his arm. He survived. He was treated. He became a piece of physical evidence in his own right. A gunshot wound to the arm produces a medical record. It produces a hospital admission. It produces, depending on the angle and the depth of the wound, recoverable forensic material. The Met's Trident detectives now had a casing-only scene from October and a victim with wound scene from November, both on the same estate, both inside a 4-week window, both consistent with the same kind of gang feud activity that was being played out simultaneously on social media. What neither investigation had at that stage was a named suspect. Trident's job in those early weeks was to work the physical evidence at each scene and the intelligence picture across the borough, looking for the people who had handled the firearm before it was used and the people who had directed where it was pointed. The two scenes were under separate investigation. The link between them, and the link between both shootings and a wider gang operation, would not become fully clear until a phone arrived in the evidence locker from a completely different incident in a completely different county. You can see why a Woolwich-based gang would choose Cherry Orchard as a place to fire shots. The Cherry Orchard estate has historically been associated with a separate, long-established South London gang, whose name is publicly documented in older police and media reporting. The geography of South London gang feuds tends to map onto specific postcodes and specific estates, and a gang from one postcode firing rounds in a rival postcode's estate is one of the recognised patterns of how a feud escalates. The act of going to the rival estate and discharging a firearm is itself a statement, separate from whether anyone is hit. It says that the gang was here. It says that the gang knows where the rivals live. It says that the gang has the means to come back. The mindset that produces a video assigning bullets to named individuals, and the mindset that produces actual rounds being fired on a specific estate against probable real targets, is the same mindset. The two activities are part of the same operation. The video is the threat. The shooting is the follow-through. In a courtroom setting, where the prosecution has to establish a conspiracy between named individuals to possess firearms with intent to endanger life, the existence of both layers in the same time window is exactly the kind of evidence that turns an aspirational charge into a conviction. By the time the Woolly O case reached its sentencing hearing in March 2025, both Cherry Orchard shootings had been formally linked to the gang through the contents of the seized phone. Evidence pertaining to both incidents was recovered from Adu's device. The link between the gang's digital threats and the physical violence on the estate had been established, in evidential terms, by the gang's own records. The Trident detectives who had been working both scenes from the physical end were, eventually, meeting the Essex police investigators who had been working from the phone end. Both ends of the case converged on the same 6 men. The phone that joined those two ends together did not arrive in police hands through a planned operation. It arrived because of a robbery in a town in Essex on a Monday evening in November that nobody in the Woolly O gang had any reason to think would matter beyond the £4,000 they were trying to take. Section 4. Aveley, the £4,000 robbery and the magazine on the floor. Aveley is a small town in Thurrock, Essex, just inside the M25 on the north side of the Thames. The town sits about 20 miles east of central London, accessible from southeast London either by car along the A13 or via the Dartford crossing. On a normal Monday evening in November, the streets of Aveley are quiet, lights in front rooms, cars parked on driveways. The kind of suburban Essex commuter town where most people are home by 7 and the high street has thinned out by 9. On the evening of Monday, November 20th, 2023, that ordinary suburban quiet was about to be interrupted by an act of violence that would eventually crack open one of the most significant South London gang firearms cases of the year. The setup on paper was a phone sale. 3 men had agreed to meet members of the Woolly O gang in Aveley to purchase some phones. The arrangement had been made in advance. Both sides knew the meeting point. Both sides showed up. From the perspective of the 3 buyers, the trip was a straightforward transaction. Bring the cash, collect the phones, drive home. From the perspective of the Woolio members who had set up the meeting, the trip was something else. The three buyers were carrying £4,000 in cash. The Woolios were carrying a handgun. What happened at the meeting point was a robbery. The three buyers were stripped of the £4,000 in cash. One of the victims was struck by one of the gang members holding a handgun. The strike was direct and physical, the kind of impact that uses the weapon itself as a blunt instrument. The contact made between the firearm and the victim's body was hard enough to dislodge the loaded magazine from the grip of the gun. The magazine fell to the ground. Whether the gang member noticed the magazine fall in the moment or only realised later when they checked the weapon, the outcome was the same. By the time the Woolios left the scene with the cash, they had also left a piece of forensic evidence on the pavement. The suspects ran. Essex police were called. By the time the responding officers arrived at the scene, the gang was gone. The three victims were left behind with their account of the robbery, and the loaded handgun magazine was sitting on the ground exactly where it had fallen. Officers recovered the magazine. The recovery was the moment the case began. A loaded magazine, found at a robbery scene where one of the victims had been struck by a man holding a handgun, is not a piece of evidence that gets logged and forgotten. It is the start of a firearms investigation. Essex Police's Serious and Organised Crime Unit was the team that picked it up. To put that in perspective, a loaded handgun magazine recovered from a public scene in Essex is the kind of physical evidence that triggers a specific protocol. The magazine itself is examined for fingerprints. The rounds inside it are catalogued. The make and model are matched against any other firearms incidents the force is currently working. The location is treated as a crime scene, with all the standard preservation techniques. Within hours of the recovery, the SOCU team had a working file on a robbery involving a firearm in Aveley, with the firearm itself missing, but a critical part of it sitting in evidence storage. The next morning, Tuesday 21st of November 2023, officers from Essex Police carrying out further inquiries returned to the same scene. The decision to send officers back to a scene the morning after a serious incident is standard practice in any major investigation. Daylight changes the visibility of the area. Witnesses who were not available the night before may now be approachable. Suspects who left the scene in a hurry sometimes return, either to retrieve something they dropped or because the area is part of their routine movements. On this particular morning, the second possibility was the one that played out. While carrying out inquiries at the location, the officers came across a young man on the same street where the robbery had taken place the night before. The man was 19 years old. He was standing in a position that placed him at the same scene, the morning after the firearms robbery, in circumstances that did not have an innocent explanation available. When officers addressed him, he claimed to be cleaning his shoes. The shoe cleaning explanation, on a residential street in Aveley, on the morning after a £4,000 robbery had taken place at the same location, was not the kind of answer that holds up under any reasonable scrutiny. The officers searched him. What they found in his possession was a zombie knife. A zombie knife is a specific category of bladed weapon banned under UK law since 2016, characterised by a serrated edge, a long blade, and aesthetic features designed to evoke horror imagery. Possession of a zombie knife in a public place is itself a criminal offence. The 19-year-old was arrested on the spot. His name was Brian Adu. The arrest of Adu on a possession of a bladed article charge on the morning after the Aveley robbery was the second significant piece of evidence to enter the case file inside 24 hours. What none of the officers searching him on that street could have known, in that exact moment, was that the phone in his possession contained the entire archive that would eventually convict 5 other men. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The 19-year-old standing on that residential street in Aveley was not a peripheral figure. He had a specific name, a specific address in Lambeth, and a specific role inside the Woolio gang that the police did not yet understand. The phone they took off him would change all of that within days. Section 5. Brian Adu, the zombie knife, and the phone that broke the case open. Brian Adu was 19 years old at the time of his arrest in Aveley. His address, as recorded in the official court documents and police press releases, was Whitgift Street in London, postcode SE11. Whitgift Street sits in Lambeth, on the south bank of the Thames, a few minutes' walk from the Imperial War Museum and the Lambeth North Tube Station. The geography is worth noting because it places Adu on the western edge of South London, away from the Woolwich and Greenwich postcodes where the Woolio gang took its name and most of its members lived. He was the youngest of the 6 men who would eventually be sentenced for the conspiracy. He was also the one whose personal device contained the evidence that connected the rest of them to each other. The arrest itself was almost ordinary. A young man on a residential street in Essex, the morning after a robbery, with a zombie knife on him, telling officers he was cleaning his shoes. The lie was thin, the knife was concrete. The arrest produced an immediate possession of a bladed article charge that would later be added to the wider firearms conspiracy case. Adu was taken into custody. His phone was seized as part of standard booking procedure. The phone went into evidence storage. From there, it went to the digital forensics team that would unlock it and document its contents. What the digital forensics team found on the phone was, in the eventual phrasing of the official record, a high volume of criminal material referencing gang violence. The volume mattered. A single video on a phone on its own can be explained away. A single message on its own can be misread or denied. A high volume of material spread across multiple categories, dated across the relevant time window, featuring multiple identifiable members of the same gang, is something the defence cannot credibly distance itself from. Adu's phone was not a casual personal device. It was an operational record of the gang's activity across a period of weeks, sitting inside a single handset that he had been carrying with him on the morning officers found him. The categories of material on the phone broke down into specific evidential strands. Footage of the group handling firearms, drill content referencing the criminal use of those weapons, the video featuring Rakib Ladega, in which bullets were assigned to named individuals from rival gangs, messages celebrating the shooting of a rival gang member, which would later be matched against one of the Cherry Orchard incidents, messages discussing how to retrieve the loaded handgun magazine that had been lost during the Aveley robbery, messages attempting to pressure the victim of the Aveley robbery into withdrawing his support for the prosecution. Each strand was a separate evidential thread. Together, they wove into a near-complete picture of the gang's activity. Adu was 19, the youngest member of a 6-man gang, in the most exposed position at the bottom of the structure, holding the device that contained the digital fingerprints of every other member's actions. The mindset is the giveaway. Younger members of organised criminal groups often end up as the de facto archivists of the operation, because they are the most active on social media, the most embedded in the digital culture the gang operates within, and the least likely to think about which folder a particular video lives in, or which messaging app retains which logs. Adu's phone was probably not even unusual within the Woolio group. What made it the prosecution's central exhibit was the fact that it was the one the police had managed to seize. You can see how a 19-year-old would have come to hold that phone in that moment. The Aveley robbery had been a group operation. He had been part of it. The next morning, for whatever reason, he was back at the scene. Possibly to look for the dropped magazine the gang had been messaging about. Possibly because he had not yet left the area. Possibly because of some other connection to the location that has not been made public. The shoe cleaning explanation did not hold. The zombie knife was discovered on him during the search. The phone was taken off him as part of the same booking procedure that handles the knife. Once the phone was unlocked and the contents were catalogued, Essex Police's SOCU team had something the Met's Trident team had been working towards from the other end. The 2 Cherry Orchard shootings that the Met had been investigating since October and November 2023 now had a digital connection point. Messages on Adu's phones celebrated one of the shootings. Other content tied the gang to the wider feud that had produced both. The 2 streams of investigation, one in Essex and one in London, were now operating off the same evidence base. Adu eventually pleaded guilty. Specifically, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to cause fear of violence between 23rd of October 2023 and 22nd of November 2023. He had previously pleaded guilty to the offence of possession of a knife blade or sharp-pointed article in a public place on 21st of November 2023, the day of his arrest in Aveley. The 2 guilty pleas would eventually combine to produce his original sentence at Basildon Crown Court in March 2025. That original sentence would later be referred to the Court of Appeal as unduly lenient and increased. The wider point about Aidu, separate from his individual sentencing, is the role his phone played in the prosecution's ability to charge 5 other men. Without the phone, the Aveley robbery is a standalone incident with a recovered magazine and a single arrest on a knife possession charge. With the phone, it becomes the entry point to a 41.5-year combined sentencing total handed down across 6 defendants linked to 2 shootings, a robbery, a perversion of justice conspiracy, and a wider organised firearms operation. One handset in one teenager's pocket on one morning in Aveley produced the evidence pile for the entire case. What the phone gave investigators was a roadmap. The next 18 months of work, across 2 police forces and the Crown Prosecution Service, would be spent following the names on that roadmap to the addresses where they slept and the courtrooms where they would eventually stand. Section 6. The investigation. 3 parallel cases stitched into one. By the end of November 2023, the police forces working on what would eventually become the Woolley O case were running 3 separate investigations that nobody had yet formally joined together. The Metropolitan Police's Trident Crime Command had the first Cherry Orchard shooting from October, with the 2 9mm casings and an unidentified target. Trident also had the second Cherry Orchard shooting from November, with the non-fatal arm wound. Essex Police's Serious and Organised Crime Unit had the Aveley robbery from the 20th of November, with the recovered magazine, the seized phone from Brian Aidu, and the knife arrest. 3 investigations, 2 forces, different operational structures, different geographic remits. What stitched them together was the digital forensic work on Aidu's phone. Once the contents had been unlocked and the messages, footage and drill material had been catalogued, the connection between the Aveley robbery and the 2 Cherry Orchard shootings became visible in writing. Messages on the phone celebrated the shooting of a rival gang member, which mapped directly onto the November Cherry Orchard incident. Footage on the phone of the group handling firearms tied multiple Woolley O members to the same operational firearms cache that was used in both the shootings and the robbery. The threat content, including the bullet assignment video, established the gang's intent across the entire time window. The 2 forces began working in parallel from late 2023 onwards, with the Crown Prosecution Service joining the investigation as the case came together. In March 2024, the 3 separate investigations were formally combined into one joint case. The decision to combine was significant. It meant that the prosecution would be presenting all 6 defendants, 2 shootings, 1 robbery, and the wider digital evidence base as a single conspiracy rather than as separate offences. Conspiracy charges have a specific evidential threshold. The prosecution has to demonstrate that the defendants were acting together with a shared criminal intent across a defined time window. The phone material, by establishing that intent in writing, was the spine that made the conspiracy case possible. The arrest phase ran from December 2023 through to May 2024. 6 men were eventually taken into custody across that 6-month window. The pacing of the arrests reflected the standard tradecraft of a multi-defendant organised crime investigation. Each new arrest had to be timed against the existing evidence pile, the risk of evidence destruction, and the possibility of the remaining suspects fleeing the area or going to ground. The geography of the gang spanned at least 5 South London postcodes and the borders of Essex. Coordinating the arrests across that geographic footprint required the kind of close working partnership between Essex Police and the Met that does not always exist between neighbouring forces. In this case, the partnership held. The men arrested between December 2023 and May 2024 covered the full operational spread of the gang. Aidu had been picked up first, the morning after Aveley. The remaining 5 were located through follow-up investigation work that drew on the phone evidence, the digital connections between members, and the standard tradecraft of identifying associates through known addresses, vehicles, and social connections. By the end of May 2024, all 6 men were in custody and charged with firearms offences relating to the shootings and the wider conspiracy. The charge sheet that the Crown Prosecution Service eventually settled on was conspiracy to possess firearms with intent to endanger life, or to cause fear of violence, depending on the specific role of each defendant. 2 of the 6 were also charged with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, related to the messages found on the phone attempting to pressure the Aveley robbery victim into withdrawing his support for the prosecution. The 2 charges together captured both the firearms element and the witness intimidation element of the gang's activity. 4 of the 6 men decided early to plead guilty. The other 2 chose to fight the case at trial. The decision to fight a firearms conspiracy case, where the prosecution holds a phone full of the gang's own footage, is not a decision that produces good outcomes for the defendants involved. But the option exists, and 2 of the Woolly O members took it. The trial was scheduled at Basildon Crown Court. The decision to hold the trial in Essex, rather than in a South London Crown Court, reflected the lead role Essex police had played in the investigation and the original location of the Aveley robbery that triggered the wider case. The trial commenced on Monday, 2nd December 2024, at Basildon Crown Court. It ran for 8 weeks. The 2 defendants who had decided to contest the case were Defay Oregon and Karan Singh. The 4 who had pleaded guilty on the first day of trial were Adu, Rakib Ladega, Stephen Ayanle, and Gabriel Adepoju. The 8-week trial was dedicated to the prosecution's case against the 2 contesting defendants, with the jury asked to assess the same digital evidence pile that had already produced 4 guilty pleas from their alleged co-conspirators. On Wednesday, 29th January 2025, the jury returned its verdicts. Both Oregon and Singh were convicted of conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to endanger life between 23rd October 2023 and 22nd November 2023, and of conspiracy to pervert the course of justice between 19th November 2023 and 15th February 2024, 2 convictions each. The full evidence pile, including the phone material, the surveillance work, and the wider investigative evidence, had been enough to break their defense cases. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Of the 2 men who took the case to trial and lost, one would receive the heaviest sentence handed down across the entire Woolly O group. His name was Defay Oregon. He was 22 years old. He lived on Eddington Road in Abbey Wood. His role inside the gang, by the time the case reached the sentencing hearing, would carry a 15-year term. Section 7. Defay Oregon and Karan Singh, the 2 who fought the case and lost. Defay Oregon was 22 years old at the time of his conviction. His address was Eddington Road in Abbey Wood, postcode SE2. Abbey Wood sits in the southeastern corner of Greenwich Borough, a residential area connected to central London by the Elizabeth line and bordered to the north by Thamesmead. The geography places him squarely inside the Woolly O gang's operating territory. Abbey Wood is a short journey from Woolwich. It sits within the cluster of postcodes the gang took its name from. Oregon's role inside the gang, as the 8-week trial would eventually establish, was significant enough that the court treated him as the figure carrying the heaviest individual responsibility for the conspiracy. Karan Singh was 19. He was the 2nd youngest member of the gang, only marginally older than Brian Adu. His address was Sandy Hill Road in southeast London, postcode SE18. SE18 is the Woolwich postcode itself. Singh was operating from the heart of the gang's home territory. The 2 men, Oregon and Singh, were the ones who decided to contest the prosecution's case at trial rather than plead. The decision was a calculation. They had seen the evidence pile. They had seen the phone material. They had seen the 4 other defendants accept guilty pleas on the first day of trial. They decided, regardless of all of that, to put the prosecution to proof. The mindset behind that decision is worth pausing on. By the time the trial opened on December 2nd, 2024, Oregon and Singh knew, in detail, what the prosecution had on them. The disclosure process inside any serious organised crime case requires the Crown Prosecution Service to provide the defence with the full evidence pile in advance of trial. The 2 men had access to the phone footage, the messages, the surveillance work, the witness statements, and the forensic results from the magazine recovered in Aveley. They had time to take legal advice on the strength of the case against them. They went to trial anyway. Detective Inspector Yoni Adler from Essex Police's SOCU team summarised what happened next in plain language. He said that 2 of the defendants had chosen not to admit their guilt, had challenged the evidence, and had made up stories about their involvement. The phrasing was deliberate. He was describing, in the official record, a pattern that anyone who has worked organised crime cases will recognise. Defendants who know the evidence is overwhelming will sometimes still take the case to trial on the basis that the jury might miss something, the witnesses might fail to attend, or some other procedural opening might emerge. The strategy almost never works in cases where the prosecution holds digital evidence as comprehensive as the Woolio phone material. The 8-week trial walked the jury through the entire prosecution case: the Cherry Orchard shootings, the casings, the wounded victim from November, the Aveley robbery and the recovered magazine, the contents of Adu's phone, the bullet assignment video featuring Ladega, the celebration messages tied to the Cherry Orchard incidents, the retrieval messages tied to the dropped magazine, the pressure messages tied to the witness intimidation. Each piece of evidence was presented in sequence, with the prosecution barristers walking the jury through the chain of inference that connected each strand to each defendant. The defense cases for Oregon and Singh, as Adler indicated, were built around stories about their involvement that the jury was being asked to accept as alternatives to the prosecution's narrative. The specifics of those defense cases have not been published in full because the trial reporting focused on the convictions rather than the failed defense strategies. What is on the public record is that the jury saw through the stories, finding both men guilty. The jury returned its verdict on Wednesday, 29th January 2025. Both Oregon and Singh were convicted on 2 charges each. The first was conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to endanger life between 23rd October 2023 and 22nd November 2023. The second was conspiracy to pervert the course of justice between 19th November 2023 and 15th February 2024. The 2 charges together captured the firearms element and the witness intimidation element of the gang's wider activity. The dates on the firearms conspiracy mapped onto the period that included both Cherry Orchard shootings and the Aveley robbery. The 2 men were now in the same legal position as the 4 who had pleaded guilty earlier, but with one critical difference: they had not received the credit for an early guilty plea. Under English sentencing guidelines, a defendant who pleads guilty at the first reasonable opportunity is entitled to a substantial reduction in their sentence, often in the region of 1/3. A defendant who fights the case to trial and loses receives no such reduction. The reduction applies regardless of the strength of the evidence. The structural effect is that defendants in possession of overwhelming evidence pile, who still choose to fight, end up with significantly longer sentences than co-conspirators in the same case who pleaded. For Oregon and Singh, the absence of that 1/3 credit, combined with the fact that they had been convicted on 2 charges rather than 1, produced a sentencing arithmetic that was always going to be heavier than the 4 who had pleaded. The judge, His Honour Judge Graham, would shortly have to assess the appropriate sentence for each man given his role, his age, his record, and his decision to contest the case. The hearing was scheduled for Friday, 28th of March 2025, at the same Basildon Crown Court where the trial had concluded. Both men had been remanded in custody pending the sentencing hearing. The 4 defendants who had pleaded guilty on the first day of trial were the ones who had read the situation accurately. Their names, addresses, and individual roles told a compressed version of how the gang had been put together, and the pleas they had entered would set the lower end of the sentencing range that the court was about to apply across all 6. Section 8. The 4 guilty pleas and the men who had read the evidence. The 4 men who pleaded guilty on the first day of trial at Basildon Crown Court took a different view of the evidence pile from the one Oregon and Singh had taken. Their view was that the prosecution case was strong enough that contesting it was a worse option than entering early pleas and securing the credit reduction. The 4 were Brian Adu, Roquib Ladega, Stephen A. Anley, and Gabriel Adepoju. Each of them had a specific address, a specific role, and a specific date range tied to the firearms conspiracy charge they were accepting. Brian Adu was 19 years old. His address was Whitgift Street in Lambeth, postcode SE11. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to cause fear of violence between 23rd October 2023 and 22nd November 2023. He had previously pleaded guilty to possession of a knife blade or sharp-pointed article in a public place on November 21st, 2023, the day of his arrest in Aveley. The two pleas together captured both the firearms conspiracy element and the bladed article offence from the morning the case began. Adu was the gang member whose phone had unlocked the rest of the prosecution case. The plea was a recognition that the contents of his own device made any defence essentially impossible. Roquib Ladega was 23. His address was Westhorn Avenue in Eltham, postcode SE9. Eltham sits in the south of Greenwich Borough, a few miles south of Woolwich. Ladega pleaded guilty to conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to cause fear of violence between 23rd October 2023 and 22nd November 2023. The decision to plead, in his case, sat awkwardly next to the fact that he was the Woolio member who had appeared in the most damaging single piece of content on Adu's phone, the video in which bullets had been assigned to named individuals from rival gangs. The plea acknowledged that the video, combined with the rest of the evidence pile, made any contested defence a losing proposition. Stephen Ayanle was 28. He was the oldest member of the gang by a clear margin. His address was Irwood Road in Charlton, postcode SE7. Irwood Road runs through Charlton itself, the same Greenwich neighbourhood that contains the Cherry Orchard estate, where the two shootings had taken place in October and November 2023. The geography is striking. Ayanle lived in the same neighbourhood the Woolio gang had been firing rounds in. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to cause fear of violence between 23rd October 2023 and 22nd November 2023. The plea captured his role inside the conspiracy without engaging with the question of how a man living in Charlton ended up affiliated with a Woolwich-based gang shooting on his own neighbourhood's streets. Gabriel Adepoju was 23. His address was Romney Road in West Norwood, postcode SE27. West Norwood sits in the borough of Lambeth, on the western edge of South London, well outside the Greenwich and Woolwich postcodes where most of the gang operated. Adepoju was geographically the outlier in the group. He pleaded guilty to 2 charges. The first was conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to cause fear of violence between 23rd October 2023 and 22nd November 2023. The second was conspiracy to pervert the course of justice between November 19, 2023 and February 15, 2024. The second charge tied him directly to the messages on Adu's phone that had attempted to pressure the Aveley robbery victim into withdrawing his support for the prosecution. You can see the structural logic of the 4 guilty pleas. Each of these defendants had specific evidence on the phone, in the surveillance file, or in the witness intimidation messaging that made any defence effectively impossible. Adu had been arrested with the phone itself. Ladega was on camera assigning bullets. Ayanle lived in the neighbourhood of the shootings. Adepoju had been part of the post-robbery effort to silence the victim. Each man, looking at the disclosure, would have come to the same conclusion. The credit reduction for an early plea was the only meaningful piece of leverage available to them. The trial would not produce a better outcome. The contrast with Oregon and Singh is the structural contrast of the entire case. 2 men fought, 4 men pleaded. The 4 who pleaded were sentenced on charges that did not include the more serious framing of conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to endanger life that the 2 contested defendants ended up convicted of. The 4 pleas were entered on the lesser, though still serious framing of conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to cause fear of violence. The choice of framing for each defendant reflected the role each had played and the evidence specific to that role. By the time the sentencing hearing arrived on Friday 28 March 2025, the court had 4 early guilty pleas and 2 contested convictions to deal with. His Honour Judge Graham had to apply the sentencing arithmetic across 6 defendants whose offences ran from late October 2023 through to the witness intimidation period in February 2024. 6 different sentences were about to be handed down in a single morning, the cumulative total of which would push past 41 years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Each name in the dock that morning had its own number waiting for it. Dafe Oregon's number was the highest. Karan Singh's was the second highest. Stephen Ayanle, Rakib Ladega, Brian Adu, and Gabriel Adepoju followed in descending order. By the time His Honour Judge Graham finished reading the sentences out, the Woolio gang as an operational entity had ceased to exist. Section 9. 28th March 2025 at Basildon Crown Court. 6 names, 41.5 years. On Friday 28th March 2025, the 6 members of the Woolio gang walked into Basildon Crown Court for the sentencing hearing that closed off the case Essex Police and the Metropolitan Police had spent 18 months building. Each defendant had either pleaded out or been convicted at trial. Each one was about to learn how the court would read their specific role inside the conspiracy. By the end of the morning, the total sentencing handed down across the 6 would reach 41 years and 6 months. At the top of the sentencing list was Dafe Oregon, 22 years old, Eddington Road, Abbey Wood. Convicted at trial on 29th of January 2025 of conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to endanger life between 23rd October 2023 and 22nd November 2023, and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice between November 19th, 2023 and February 15th, 2024. Oregon was sentenced to 15 years. The figure was the highest individual sentence imposed across the entire group. It reflected the gravity of the conspiracy charge framed as intent to endanger life, the additional perverting charge, the absence of credit for an early guilty plea, and the court's reading of his role inside the gang. Below Oregon sat Karan Singh, 19 years old, Sandy Hill Road, Woolwich, postcode SE18. Convicted at the same trial, on the same 2 charges, on the same day, Singh was sentenced to 9 years, 6 years lower than Oregon, despite carrying identical convictions on identical charges. The difference reflected the court's view of the relative roles each man had played, his age at the time of the offences, and the specific aggravating and mitigating factors His Honour Judge Graham weighed in his sentencing remarks. 9 years for a 19-year-old still placed Singh in custody until well past his late 20s. Stephen Ayanle received the 3rd highest sentence, 28 years old, Irwood Road, Charlton, postcode SE7. He had pleaded guilty on the first day of trial to conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to cause fear of violence between October 23, 2023 and November 22, 2023. Ayanle was sentenced to 5 years. His was the highest sentence among the 4 who had entered guilty pleas. The figure reflected his age, his role, and the fact that he was the oldest member of the gang and had been operating from a Charlton address that placed him geographically inside the territory the shootings had taken place in. Rakib Ladega received 4 years and 6 months. 23 years old, Westhorn Avenue, Eltham, postcode SE9. Pleaded guilty on the same charge as Ayanle. The video featuring Ladega assigning bullets to named individuals from rival gangs had been the single most damaging piece of digital content in the prosecution case. The 4 years and 6 months reflected his role inside the conspiracy and the credit applied for his early guilty plea. The figure would later be referred to the Court of Appeal as unduly lenient, with consequences that would land in June. Brian Adu received 4 years for conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to cause fear of violence, with 6 months concurrent for possession of the bladed article from the morning of his arrest in Aveley. 19 years old, Whitgift Street, Lambeth, postcode SE11. The youngest member of the gang, the man whose phone had unlocked the entire case. 4 years for the conspiracy charge, with the bladed article term running alongside it rather than after it. His sentence too would be referred to the Court of Appeal. Gabriel Adepoju received 4 years, 23 years old, Romney Road, West Norwood, postcode SE27. Pleaded guilty to 2 charges. Conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to cause fear of violence between 23rd October 2023 and 22nd November 2023, and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice between November 19, 2023 and February 15, 2024. The 4-year sentence reflected the combined effect of the 2 charges, with credit applied for the early guilty pleas. Add the figures together. 15 years for Oregon, 9 for Singh, 5 for Ayanle, 4 years and 6 months for Ladiega, 4 years for Adu, with 6 months concurrent, 4 years for Adepoju. The cumulative total was 41 years and 6 months of immediate custody, distributed across 6 men aged between 18 and 28, all of them connected to one Woolwich-based gang and the digital evidence pile recovered from one phone in Aveley. Detective Inspector Yoni Adler from Essex Police's Serious and Organised Crime Unit summarised the case afterwards. He described the convictions as the result of outstanding and committed detective work by both Essex Police's SOCU and the Met's Trident teams. He said that the Woolios had boasted about their criminal activity, had come to Essex to commit further crime, and had carried firearms while filming themselves doing so. He said they had tried to glamorise their lifestyle, but it was a lifestyle that had caught up with them. The phrasing was not editorial. It was a description, in plain language, of what the evidence pile had established in court. His Honour Judge Graham issued judges' commendations to officers in the investigation teams. The commendations recognised the 18 months of cross-force work that had produced the convictions and the sentencing total. Judges' commendations are not awarded routinely. They reflect investigations the bench considers exceptional in their conduct or scale. The 41.5-year total looked like the closing of the case on the morning the sentences were handed down. Within 12 weeks, the Solicitor General would refer the entire group sentencing back to the Court of Appeal, on the basis that the figures imposed had been unduly lenient. 2 of the 6 were about to find out that the sentencing arithmetic was not actually finished. Section 10. The June 2025 Appeal and what the Woolio case proves. The Solicitor General Lucy Rigby, KCMP, referred the entire Woolio sentencing to the Court of Appeal under the unduly lenient sentence scheme on Thursday, 20th June 2025. The scheme allows the law officers of the Crown to ask the appeal court to review sentences that appear, in their judgment, to fall below the appropriate range for the offences involved. All 6 Woolio sentences were referred together. The appeal hearing would assess each one and decide whether the original figures had been outside the scope of reasonable judicial discretion. The Court of Appeal returned its decision on the same hearing. The court found that 4 of the 6 original sentences, while on the lenient side, sat within the range of reasonable judicial discretion and were not unduly lenient in the strict legal sense the scheme required. Oregon's 15 years stood. Singh's 9 years stood. Ayanle's 5 years stood. Adepoju's 4 years stood. 2 sentences were increased. The 2 were Roqib Ladega and Brian Adu. Ladega's sentence was increased from 4 years and 6 months to 5 years. The increase reflected the appeal court's reading of his role, and particularly the centrality of the bullet assignment video to the prosecution case. Adu's sentence was increased from 4 years to 5 years, with the 6-month concurrent term for the bladed article folded into a total of 5 years and 9 months. The increase took into account the full range of his offending and the role his phone had played in unlocking the wider conspiracy. The Solicitor General's public statement after the appeal called the Woolios a ruthless gang who had boasted about their criminal activities online while using dangerous weapons to terrorise and threaten their communities. Detective Inspector Yoni Adler said the appeal court had upheld the view that the original sentences had been unduly lenient and had imposed terms more fitting to the seriousness of the offending. The phrasing on both sides was deliberate. Each statement was anchoring the case as a precedent for how courts should be sentencing visible, evidence-rich firearms conspiracies in the future. Step back from the appeal hearing and the structural pattern of the Woolio case becomes visible. A gang based in Woolwich, a feud with another London gang, 2 shootings on the Cherry Orchard estate in Charlton, a robbery in Aveley that produced a recovered handgun magazine and a phone seizure, a digital evidence pile that connected 6 men to one operational firearms conspiracy, an 8-week trial, 6 convictions, a sentencing total of 41 years and 6 months, 2 sentences increased on appeal 3 months later. The whole sequence ran from late October 2023 to June 2025. 20 months from the first 9mm casing on the Cherry Orchard estate to the last appeal hearing at the Royal Courts of Justice. What the case proves more clearly than almost any comparable London gun crime prosecution of recent years, is that the visibility was the kill switch. The Woolio members had not been brought down by undercover surveillance, by long-term informant work, or by a sustained covert operation. They had been brought down by the contents of one phone, recovered the morning after a robbery that nobody outside the gang had any reason to anticipate. The phone contained material the gang had voluntarily produced and stored. The material proved the conspiracy. The conspiracy produced the convictions. The convictions produced the sentences. There is something almost orderly about the sequence once you look at it from a distance. A gang forms inside a postcode. The gang feuds with a rival gang. The members pick up phones and film themselves with weapons. The members produce drill content that names individuals and assigns bullets to them. The content travels across social media and through messaging apps to audiences that include both the rivals and the wider digital ecosystem. A robbery goes wrong. A magazine drops. A phone gets seized. The footage and the messages are now inside an Essex police evidence locker. The court reads the contents in front of a Basildon jury. The sentences run into the decades. The mindset is the giveaway. Members of the Woolio gang who sat in front of cameras and held firearms in their hands probably believed they were performing for the rivals, or for the wider drill audience, or for their own social standing inside the gang. The audience they actually performed for, in the end, was a Crown Court jury that needed about 3 seconds per clip to understand what it was looking at. The same content that had been produced to intimidate enemies became the content that convicted the people who produced it. Edu's phone produced the case. The Degas video produced the most damaging single exhibit. Oregon's decision to fight the case at trial produced the heaviest individual sentence. Each member contributed something to the pile that would eventually be used against him. The gang did not need a betrayal, an informant, or an external compromise of any kind. It generated its own conviction evidence and stored it on the same handsets it carried in its pockets. The Woolio members posted their threats and filmed their guns in 2023. The Court of Appeal increased their sentences in 2025. The gap between those two moments was 20 months. 20 months from the phone footage to the prison years. The trail was found. The men who built it are now behind bars. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.